Um, Welcome to Shots with Soldiers. This is the 6th episode. Thank you for coming on. The general sends his regards, but as you know, he is vaccinating Ontario. So he is unable to join us, but we have a great guest for you today. This is retired Master Corporal Mike Akapata. He did 26 years in the reserves in the Essex and Kent Scottish Regiment. He did a tour to Afghanistan in 2007. He also was a Windsor police officer for 21 years, and he is now a city councillor for the town of LaSalle, and he's working for RIM Blackberry. His work with BlackBerry is in the, digital security, and as we know, the best in the world in terms of that. And just like our Canadian soldiers, the two go hand in hand in terms of the quality. Today, he's got a great soldier for us, and I'm going to hand it over to Mike. Mike, thank you for doing this on short notice, and welcome to Shots with Soldiers.
Thank you very much, Bruce. I appreciate being here. And it's almost like you planned exactly the introduction. One of the best things about being in the CF that I've experienced over the 26 years is the great men and women you get to work with. Nobody has ever questioned your capabilities. Nobody says, but you shouldn't be here. And I bring this up especially now. People have asked me over my career, why would you join the Army? Why would you want to do this? And one of the things that I tell them is that Canadian sacrifice is an issue that we as Canadians do. Some of the best men and women I've ever met and had the privilege to work with, to lead and to follow, wear the uniform of the Canadian Armed Forces. Regardless of whether they're Navy, Air Force, we kid each other as infanteers with everyone else. But at the end of the day, that maple leaf on your sleeve ties us all together. So I've had questions about the armed forces and service. And one of the things I say is there always has to be a first one. There has to be someone who breaks down those barriers and opens the doors. And in this case, the gentleman who I'm going to speak to today is the first Black Canadian officer, and depending on where you do your research, the first Black officer in the Empire and the Commonwealth. His name is William Andrew White. And I'm going to share my screen here. So when we start to talk about Canada, and from a Black Canadian soldier's retired perspective, one of the best things about this country is egalitarian treatment, especially now. That was not always the way. So let's make sure that we don't skip over some of the history, but also look at the history of service. This is a picture from 1959. This is a picture of one of the first Black entire regiments that was stood up in Canada, the Victoria Pioneer Rifle Corps. Their view very simply was the Americans were thinking about invading Canada, and they had come, a lot of them had lived in the United States, fled persecution to Canada. And they decided that this country that was treating them so well was worth defending. So they stood up a corps in 1859. They drilled, they had NCOs, NCMs, and ironically, faced some of the discrimination of the times that persons of color would have faced. But it made no difference in their commitment to king, country, and the colors. Very, very simply, this country has always been a place where if you apply yourself, you can find sanctuary. The armed forces is a place where egalitarianism rules. I use an example for me in Afghanistan. Nobody cared who you were. Nobody cared what your sexual orientation was. Nobody cared anything. If you had the same uniform and the flag on your shoulder, you shall be a brother or a sister of mine. And that has been my experience as a Black soldier. And it goes to the views of Canadians et al. And those views translate into the service that we have here. Let me speak humbly about this gentleman. He came from the United States and became our first Black officer. Captain Reverend William White, born from formerly enslaved parents, born in the Reconstruction period in the 1890s, came to Canada and from Virginia. He was a leading member of the African community, Black community in Nova Scotia, and became the chaplain for 2 Construction Battalion, which we'll touch on in a bit. Why this gentleman is so important is if you start to look at what he did as a Canadian in this country, he was a Baptist minister, and he came to study religion at Acadia. He was the second Black person to graduate from Acadia University. So let's make sure, again, this gentleman did nothing but open doors, kick down barriers, and make sure that egalitarian treatment could be bestowed on people when it was not the norm. He never stopped fighting for equality. He never stopped fighting for the things he believed in. And he never stopped remembering his friends and family in Nova Scotia. Like I said, as a reverend, he settled in, and at the highlight, he was at Zion Church in 1910. You got to start to think about the time. This gentleman had come from the United States, from enslaved parents, had settled in Nova Scotia, had settled in Canada, was allowed to get a university education, was successful. And when the war came along, Black Canadians during the First World War were discouraged from joining the CEF, the Canadian Expeditionary Force. It was he and other Black leaders that said, we belong, we want to contribute, we owe allegiance to Her Majesty and the Crown, and we want to serve. It was an uphill battle, but this gentleman was so tireless in his preservation of value and right that he wanted to make sure that Black Canadians could contribute and participate in what was going on in their country. 2 Construction Battalion was the 2nd segregated Canadian division. Now, when you start to look at the battalion, it drew people, Blacks from across Canada, the United States, and the Caribbean. So you've got to start to think about this international group of people from the Commonwealth and from other countries wanted to serve so much that they came to do this type of work. The Construction Battalion was not an armed infantry unit. It was, for lack of better words, a labor battalion. A lot of the Black soldiers were put together building trenches, cutting wood, and things of that nature. And as such, when Reverend White became the chaplain, he became a captain, honorary title. And as such, he was one of the few Black officers in the Canadian Expeditionary Force and in the British Empire. And with the research that I've done, he is the first. So when I look at the face of this gentleman, and I imagine what he went through, because he believed in something. He believed that service was bigger than self. He believed that he owed something to the country that he was not born in, but that had given him home. He believed that he owed something as an officer to the men he had the privilege to lead. And he did this fighting against discrimination, fighting against not being wanted, fighting against not being allowed to risk his life or the lives of his men in service of king and country. So you think about this, and you think about where the armed forces is now. I remember doing sharp training, for those of you who can go back in a little while, and remember when we had to do our first racial training. And the Essex and Kent Scottish Regiment in Windsor, Windsor is one of the area's 4th most diverse cities in Canada. And I describe it like this. We had a Chinese RSM, 2 Chinese officers, 3 Black master corporals, and a spattering of other folks. Nobody ever looked at us or treated us differently from my perspective. Every place we went, we were treated with respect and kindness. And that is in the military sense. We were brothers and sisters eventually in arms without anything else. So when I start to look back at my history and my time with the military, I have never felt that I've been treated differently because of the color of my skin. I have never believed that I have been denied promotion or been denied opportunity because of the color of my skin. And I truly believe this. It is gentlemen like this that started it off for the rest of us and spoke truth to power to make sure that we as Canadians are able to contribute. This is not a Black story. This is the story of Canada. This is the story of our armed forces and the regiments and the ship's companies and air crew that don't care who you are, as long as you are pure of heart and pure of spirit and pure of mind. You are welcome. And that's been my experience with the Army. I am sure that there has been some social miscues and mistakes and errors. And because the Army is built from the public, there's got to be some folks that disagree. But for the most part, I'm comfortable saying that the brothers and sisters that I have at arms, the captain would look back and be surprised. You look at this picture of him from 1917 with the other officers from the battalion. One face, sitting in the center, with the same swagger stick, the same uniform, not any different than anyone else. One of the leadership cadre for 2 Construction Battalion. This picture speaks volumes about the Canadian military. He was qualified. He was a reverend. He took care of these gentlemen's souls and spoke to them and comforted them when they were hurt. When they were hurt, one of the ironies of the world was that Anne Murray's grandfather was a medical doctor, and he took care of some of these soldiers. Bruce Murray, Captain Dan Murray served with the Canadian Medical Corps from 1917 to 1919. So when you start to think about the ties and how military service spreads throughout the Canadian population, Anne Murray's grandfather was a medical officer during the First World War, and he took care of these gentlemen. When the captain returned, he went back to Nova Scotia. He went back to being a padre. He went back to taking care of the community. He never left Nova Scotia. He never forgot his Nova Scotia pride. He never forgot what it was like to be a Canadian leader, to have the privilege of leading soldiers in the field. In 1936, he was awarded an honorary Doctor's of Divinity, and unfortunately, he passed away on September 9th, 1936, due to pneumonia. If you look at his legacy of what he has done for Canada and what he has done for the Canadian military, this gentleman said, "We can and we shall. And we shall be judged by what we bring to the table, not by the color of our skin." The Canadian Armed Forces has been a place of refuge for some. It has been a place to prove yourself. It is also a place of egalitarian treatment. On my ISCC, we all suffered the same. We all were cold, we were all wet, we were all hungry, but we did it together. There was no differentiation, and it's because of this gentleman that the pride that Canadians have in their military needs to be expressed. Today, I'm going to be toasting Captain Reverend William A. White of Nova Scotia. I have with me a nice bottle of Glenfiddich 12-year. I would ask my colleagues to charge their glass. I simply say this to those who've gone before us, to those who blazed the trail, and to those who had the privilege to lead. Leadership is something that Canadians respect, that they have, and it's been demonstrated by Captain Reverend William A. White. Cheers. Bruce, I will turn the ball back to you.
Good. turn your mic on, Bruce.
Thank you again. Sorry, Zoom. That was amazing. I really enjoyed that. Michael, as always, you hit it out of the park. We're going to open this up to any questions because we didn't do Facebook Live. It's just the 12 of us. So does anybody have any questions for Master Corporal retired Mike Akapata?
I have one. Was the force integrated from the beginning?
So as I started to do this research, during World War I, the infantry battalions somewhat were integrated. Recruiting officers could accept Black soldiers, and I actually found a company sergeant major that won the MBE who was a Black soldier. So in Nova Scotia, though, apparently the segregationist movement was such that the 2 Construction Battalion was stood up. Some white soldiers were not open-minded then and didn't want to serve with Black soldiers. But as I started to do my research, I found a number of World War I Black soldiers that served in battalions, in the PPCLI, in the RCR, and in the Vandu. They are few and far between, but as I started to do my research on them, it was the recruiting officers that allowed them to join because they wanted to serve. So even then, there was white soldiers, white officers who believed in egalitarian treatment and defied the whites only rule and brought these troops into the battalions. And they served with distinction and success.
Yeah, go ahead. Werner.
So, Master Corporal, my question to you, as being a Commonwealth at that time, did he have to learn both the Protestant and Catholic as a chaplain, or was he just to one denomination?
So again, some of the files that I've looked at, I went through his World War I record that you can get at the government website, and it doesn't specifically speak to that. So I don't know how he ministered. I don't know which services he gave, but it does speak to him giving services. So I know that a biography of him was done, and that might speak a little deeper into it, but in all of the documents that I found, it simply says chaplain. And it doesn't indicate a denomination on the military documents.
Got a question, if I can jump in, and that is simply, I mean, he was obviously in France. Do you know any more about his, I mean, obviously his troops would have been involved in multiple different aspects of the front. Do you know any sort of specific operations that he and his troops were involved with? Do you know if they were part of early build projects, or you know, what sort of work were they doing when they were in the field?
So again, 2 Construction Battalion was a support unit that dug trenches, that laid railways. The lieutenant colonel in charge was a CPR railway man. So that was one of their primary duties, was re-enhancing the railways to get them to the proper gauge for allies to move through the area. When you look at 2 Construction Battalion, it shows multiple places in France where they were. It does not speak to any armed conflict that I could find. I'm not going to suggest they didn't engage in that, but again, the primary deployment was that type of work. And one of the ironies is the recruiting poster that the government of Canada put out said, wanted colored men to join the 2 Construction Battalion. And it's a picture of them with picks and shovels over their shoulders, digging trenches. So there's a picture that came out in 2016 of the soldiers from 2 Construction Battalion on a stamp. So again, from my perspective, the government of Canada has recognized these soldiers, has recognized these troops, has recognized their contributions. But with all First World War legacy items, it becomes difficult to find tangible things to hold on to see where they are, other than some of the histories that are published online and in the books that I was able to find. So my view is, I don't want to assume that they didn't, but I surely don't want to state that they did.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think this is the part where we say this has been another great episode of Shots with Soldiers. We apologize for the technical difficulties of not being able to put this on live, but the recording will come up and you'll be able to watch this afterwards. Please like and share our videos and put it out there, and let's build this momentum that we're building. A huge thank you for Master Corporal retired Mike Akapata for filling in for the big shoes that the General has, and really doing an incredible job. And stay tuned for future episodes of Shots with Soldiers as we bring these stories of incredible Canadians to you, and we toast their memory. All you need is a shot glass and an ounce of liquid. Thank you. This has been another episode of Shots with Soldiers, and yeah, we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce.